What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over enhanced input in Unreal Engine 5.1 and higher. So for those that aren't familiar with enhanced input, basically it takes the currently existing input action input mapping system that Unreal Engine 4 and 5.0 had, changes it a little bit, and adds more functionality to it. It is technically optional. Right now I still have all my input actions that I had prior to this episode, and they are working perfectly fine. A lot of people have asked me to explore this topic, and additionally, it can be very useful in our games. Many games can benefit from this, including the fighting game tutorial series, so we've already set up pretty much everything we need for our combos and our input buffer in our fighting game. However, if we had used enhanced input, we also would have been able to achieve the result, and it would have been a little bit simpler from the get-go. So it's good to explore both methods so you can use the method of your choosing. Either one will work and either one is correct. Now in today's episode, it is a generic episode meant for all tutorials and meant for everyone. You don't have to be watching any of my other series to follow it. I am using my side-scroller Castlevania style game that I was live streaming. Everything we had in that series and everything we've been working on is in this episode, but it is not relevant for the enhanced input. I will have episodes for each series using enhanced input where necessary. So don't worry, you don't have to follow this series. It really is not important what I'm doing, even in this video right now, right here. I'm going to give you a demo of how to set up enhanced input and actually use it. And we're going to go over what a lot of the settings mean so that you can kind of configure it more to your liking. Now in this first episode, we're just going to be using Blueprint, because all of my series are going to use enhanced input in the C++ files, as well as the Blueprint, but we're going to mainly set them up in the C++. So I wanted this episode, this introductory episode, to be entirely Blueprint. That way we can cover both sides of enhanced input. Before we get started today, I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support. Really grateful, and I really appreciate everything you've done for me already. I'm excited to get this episode about enhanced input out to you because I know that you had requested this a bunch. Additionally, if you'd like to learn about other things like source control, I have some generic episodes on them as well. I'll link one right here, so you can take a look at my channel and see what else we got going on. But if you like what you see in this video right now, and this game that I've been working on during a live stream, you can feel free to click this playlist right here in the top right corner. You can check out how we've done everything that you see in here, including attacking enemies, pushing objects, adding items to our inventory, and using a shop. With all that said, we can go ahead and get started. Like I said, today's episode is going to be entirely in Blueprint, so we don't have to worry about code, even though this is a C++ and Blueprint project. The first thing we want to do is make sure that we have enhanced input enabled. And to do that, we need two things. We need to make sure that the plugin itself is enabled, and we need to make sure we're on a version that supports it. So enhanced input was added in version 5.1, so Unreal Engine 5.1. I am on 5.1.3, I believe, and so I am above the required version. Now, if you go to Edit Plugins, like I did right here, it will open up a Plugins tab. You can then search in this tab for enhanced input. So in here, you can see that there is the enhanced input plugin, and it is input handling that allows for contextual and dynamic mappings. And it is checked. We need to make sure this is checked because otherwise we can't use all the things that are required for enhanced input. If you're on a version that supports it, I believe it is automatically checked. It always has been for me. But if for any reason it's not, make sure you check it. If you had to check it and it wasn't already checked, then you'll want to make sure you restart the editor, as that is the only way you can actually use the plugins that you check. It has to load them in additionally, so once you restart, it will be loaded in and ready for use. Now there's another thing we want to do to make sure that we can use our enhanced input, and that is to go to Edit Project Settings and Input. Input is where we would always set up our input actions and input axes, which are for our standard controls in a keyboard or controller. So if we bound the up key to the jump button, then that would be an input action. So we go to input, and you can see all my action mappings are here. There's actually a little warning here that says axis and action mappings are now deprecated. Please use the enhanced input actions and input mapping context instead. As of the date of this upload, input actions and input axes still work, and you can still add to them and create more. So you can see I have all mine in here. That's not actually what we're worried about right now. We can scroll down and go to default classes. Now, there's a default player input class and a default input component class. We use these all the time throughout the tutorials because I may access them to then grab a binding or grab a mapping and then perform logic when that binding is pressed, when we press a button that one of those functions is bound to. Typically, it is just the player input class and the input component class. However, there are two new classes now, enhanced player input and enhanced input component. Those are the ones we'll want to use for today's episode. Again, this was automatically converted for me and always has been on all my UE5 projects, so I believe it will be for you as well, but it is required that these are set this way. If they are not, then you can run into issues because your enhanced input will not work. It won't be looking for these types of inputs. It'll be using the old system. Now, there are a lot of things that enhanced input can be used for, but I'm going to give a very brief description. So enhanced input can do additional things that the old input actions and input axes could not. For example, it can automatically handle dead zones. Say you have two joysticks on a controller. If the controller has a stick that drifts a little bit, so it's not sitting exactly at 0, your character may be able to avoid moving because it fits within that dead zone. Additionally, if the player is only pressing the stick a very tiny amount, it might not move the character because the stick is still sitting within that dead zone. You can do additional things with the input actions, such as adding time to your inputs. So you can actually do holds and taps separately, so you don't have to track the frames like we do in the fighting game tutorial series. It will do it for you. Let's explore an input action. So let's make one. Now, input actions are kind of weird in this case because we're used to making them from edit project settings input like I was showing you earlier. Now with enhanced input, things are a little bit different. Input actions are actually objects because they can be mapped dynamically, and different characters, different objects can actually take control of them and have different values set to their mapping. So you know how, again, in the fighting game tutorial series, we have two different characters. We have player 1 and player 2. They both control their own character. In a local match, we have to separate the keyboard inputs based on the controls that we've chosen so that player 1 and player 2 can both use the keyboard and control it. So we have two different action mappings and axes for the inputs that we have so that player 1 and player 2 can both control the characters. With enhanced input, one input action could work for both characters, for both players. So both players could play on the same device, have the same input actions, but they could have different controls. Another benefit of enhanced input. So we're going to make an object now. So we're going to go to add, and we want to go to input and select the input action. Now, I've already made one in my enhanced input folder here called enhanced jump, but we can also make another one. I can give you an example of that as well. But once you make it, go ahead and call it whatever. I'm calling it enhanced jump just for the purpose of this series. You could just call it jump if you're implementing jump using enhanced input. You don't have to add enhanced or anything. Now go into your input action and we'll take a look at what's in here. So the first thing you have is an action description. This is a descriptor of the action. So this you can actually put text in and describe what it's going to be handling. For example, you could actually say handles jump. It's not required that you put this in here. It's just something you can have to make sure that everyone is aware of what this enhanced input action is going to be doing. Now it has something you're probably familiar with from other input actions, which is consume input. See if I can get the tooltip here. Basically, what consume input does is if you have multiple input actions with the same controls, say I have two different input actions and they both have the W key. Well, if one is pressed, should it be the only one that fires or should another one fire? This is mainly good if you're separating like menu input from gameplay input and things like that. For now, I'm going to say consume input. Sure, it can be left as true. We have trigger when paused. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Should we trigger this input action when the game is paused? I'll go ahead and say yes. And reserve all mappings is actually used to reserve space for these mappings. Basically, we keep track of them so that if they are changed, like on a controlled changing screen, we still have the old ones, which we don't really care about for right now. I'll go more into this on the specific episodes where we use enhanced input in our tutorial series. You won't notice any difference now if we try and use it. The value type is what type of input is being stored and how we're handling it. So we have digital, which is a Boolean, axis 1D, 2D, and 3D, which are float, vector 2D, and vector. For any button presses, releases, Boolean is fine because it's just true or false. There's more to it than just was it pressed, was it released, but at the end of the day, it's just a button, a key press. So we can just say pressed, not pressed. Axis 1D is a float, so it can keep track of a value. So you could say like a half press, for example. Or in the case of an input axis, you could use your -1 to your +1 for your movement range. A vector 2D is 2 floats, so you have even more range. This could be used for diagonals. So if you have an up and a right, or a left and a down value that you want to store, again for diagonal movements, you could do that here. And a vector is 3 floats, X, Y, and Z. So you have your horizontal, vertical, and your depth. So if you're pressing in the stick and also moving in a direction, say you're clicking in the stick, then you're moving it up and right. Then you have 3 different values that you're tracking. For me, for the jump, I'm just going to use a digital bool. Then we have triggers and modifiers. So you can add one here if you want, and I can say that I have to press. This will only trigger on a press. But this isn't really required. So these triggers can be added as defaults, but when we add these contexts to it, which I'll get into in just a second, then you'll see that we can actually set up our individual actions. So for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to leave it blank. We're going to let the context handle everything. Remember, input actions can now be used by multiple objects, so you may want to have a default. You may want to say this trigger is of this type. It is of the press type. It is of the hold type, whatever that may be. Modifiers are very interesting. Just to give you an example, you can set things like, oh, this is for the dead zone, so this is the dead zone value. This is the response curve, or the value to world space. Again, I'm not going to be getting into it in this episode because there's not a lot of use for it, but you will be seeing it a lot in the series when we convert the systems over to enhanced input. So anyway, this is all you really need in your input action. Really, the most important thing is that you have the correct value type. The description is optional, and the consume input and trigger when paused are pretty important too. If you have a specific use case in mind for them, you want to make sure these are set properly. Now the other thing we need to add is an input context. So if we go to our add input, we can go to input mapping context here. So go ahead and select that and you'll get this guy. I've called this enhanced jump context just to keep things simple. Now going into the enhanced jump context, we have mappings and description. So the mappings here, we can press this little plus in the circle to add an action mapping. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be able to select our input actions and actually bind them to buttons with triggers and modifiers. There's also an option to allow the player to be the one to map this input, which of course is something that a lot of games have, but sometimes not all controls are mappable. So anyway, once you've added a mapping, like I said, make sure you select your input action. I've only got enhanced jump right now, but as you add more, you'll have a list. So select the one that you want. And once you do, you should automatically get an input action here, but if you don't, you can press the plus to add a control binding to the action mapping. So this is just like our old input actions, how we set those up, where you have the type of input action or the name of it, and then you add the individual keys. So at this point, you will get this right here, which will say none. This is the default value. Basically, no key can activate this. And I chose up on my keyboard as the key that executes this input action. Now, I called this context enhanced jump context because I think that keeps things simple. But really, a context is good for 2 different things that I've found so far. I'm sure it's good for even more than that as well. One thing it's really useful for is if you have 2 vastly different types of gameplay. And so you want to use the same controls for those 2 different types, but they do different things. For example, if you've ever seen a game where you have control over the character, but then you also have control over a very advanced map system, you may use a lot of the same controls, but you don't really want them to be the same, right? You're using the same inputs on the device, but they're completely different. You're basically doing 2 different actions with the same control depending on the mode you're in. Even if you just have mini games in your game. Again, same controls, but they could be entirely different actions that are happening. That's why it's called a context. It's the context of when the input is pressed and what it should do. So really, instead of calling this enhanced jump context, it would be best for us to call this something along the lines of character context. Or even like main game context, or whatever that you see fit. And then you could add another one, like I said, minigame context or map context. The other case that this is really useful for, you can put a different mapping in here. I could add another mapping that is of the controller type. So I could say gamepad, D-pad up. So now if I have up on the keyboard and up on the D-pad, the triggers could be different. The trigger on the keyboard might be a pressed, but the trigger on the gamepad could be a hold. So depending on the device I have, I could also separate the inputs and make the players use the device that they have to actually control the game. So if games are better suited for keyboard, sure, the keyboard is good to have and we want to have those in there, but input action could have handled that. However, we can make the game a little bit more convenient for gamepad users by further utilizing what they have on their gamepad. And same with vice versa. Now, I don't actually want this here. We can leave the gamepad in, it won't hurt anything. I'll leave it as pressed, but that was just an example. You change it to your liking. The minimum that we need to set up is just one input action with an input. And we're going to use press to start, but I'm going to explore the other ones as well in this episode. Is player mappable? I'm going to leave false for now, and you can set up a description if you want. For right now, again, I'm not going to really use it. It's just a demo video, so it's not required. But you could put in a description of what this context is really being used for. Now, let's go to where we can actually use this and test it. So I'm going to go to my Paladin character BP. First of all, this video is all in Blueprint. So even though I've done a lot of logic in this tutorial series in the code, I'm going to keep these values in the Blueprint for today. I'm going to show you the input action for the jump being used, and then I'm going to show you the enhanced input action for the enhanced jump and the differences between those two. I think that'll make a lot of difference in your perspective of how useful enhanced input can be. Now, one thing we want to do to make sure that we can actually use this inside the character blueprint, if you have a blueprint controller here, you can go ahead and use your controller. It would be better suited in there, but I don't. Right now, I'm just using my character blueprint for my controls. So I'm going to put my input actions in my character. Now to get these input actions, these enhanced input actions in your blueprint, you actually have to search for the name of the action. So enhanced jump is the name of my action. That's what I want to search for. And I'm going to grab the event. The value is going to return the actual value. But we don't need that right now. We just need the event. So enhanced jump. Now I've already got one, so I don't need that second one. But right here is my enhanced jump. You have a bunch of options you can use. For today's episode, I'm going to show you what all the different ones mean in this event. The triggered, started, ongoing, canceled, and completed. So what I've done is added print strings to each state so you can visualize it while I explain it. And to get a print string, if you're not aware, it's literally just print string. And what it will do is print text to the top left of the viewport if this code is hit. So when we trigger this state, then this text will print to the screen. And without explaining it, I'll just give you a quick demo. So if I press this button, you're going to see a bunch of text prints to the top left. That's what we're going to be using to debug and to show you the differences in a few minutes. It will also go to the output log, so you can take a look at it and see what strings were printed. So all I'm doing right now is using my enhanced input action, enhanced jump, and printing strings based on what happens with that button, what we've triggered on it, if it was canceled, if it's still being held down, all that good stuff. I've also added my regular input action jump here and just added a print string called input action. So you only had press to release with this one. And that's with the old system. So as I pressed the button, it printed input action in the top left there. So you can see that it fired. But then we had 3 different things print for the press and release of the enhanced input. So that's just so you can see the difference here. I actually, again, already handle my jump in the code. I don't need this input action jump in the blueprint. So I'm going to get rid of the regular input action one. I'm just going to leave the enhanced jump one here. Now, before you do this, you won't actually be able to see these strings print yet. There's one other thing we need to do to get this working. You can do this in the begin play of your character BP or your controller. But if you do this in the character blueprint like I'm doing here, there is a small thing that you'll have to account for. I'm not going to go over my begin play here because this is all relevant to the actual tutorial series that this is based off of. It is not relevant for today's episode. What is relevant is this event that I made called add enhanced input context. Now these nodes here are the only ones we need. Since I'm using the character blueprint and not a controller, when we go to cast the controller, it could fail because technically the character is spawned and then possessed. So the character spawned, begin play runs, this fails, then it's possessed, which would make the player controller valid, and then it could go through. But since it only runs once, we would actually never reach this value. So I have a small, simple solution for you if you're using the character BP here, and that is to set a timer by event. So if you call this node set timer by event in your begin play, then you can drag off the event column of this function and add custom event. And I went ahead and called mine add enhanced input context. Now in set timer by event, you can actually give a time, and basically once this node is hit, it will set a timer, and in 0.1 seconds from now, as an example, it will call this event. Then we'll do this logic. 0.1 seconds is more than enough time for the character to get possessed by the controller, so this will do what we need. Alternatively, I have a better method, but this only works if you are doing it the way I am. So if you have been following the series, or if you have a game mode that spawns characters and those characters later get possessed by a specific controller, you can use this other method. Instead of setting a timer and arbitrarily calling this event 0.1 seconds later, you can just make a new custom event, still called add enhanced input context. And immediately after possession of the character, you can drag off of the Paladin character BP object reference or whatever your character blueprint is and call your event, add enhanced input context. If you do this, then you won't need that arbitrary 0.1 second delay. This will just work because we've already possessed the character at this point. However, that does mean that you have to be spawning your character and possessing them. If you're just using the standard Unreal logic, where you have a base game mode BP with the class defaults where it spawns the pawn for you and sets the player controller class, that might not work due to the fact that the character is created before the possession, like I was explaining here. The whole reason we needed the set timer by event. So you have two methods, either will work and either is perfectly fine. You can see with this other method, I can still get the print strings, I still have everything working. So both methods work, regardless of what method you use. What we need to do is add these nodes to this event. So firstly, we want to make sure that we get the controller that belongs to this character, really the controller that is controlling this character. And you can do that by simply typing get controller. That's super simple. Then we need to cast it to the appropriate class, which in our case is the default player controller class, because we don't have our own in this series, but you can use your own custom player controller if you have one. Alternatively, if you are making this event in your player controller, you don't even have to do the cast. You can just use self. That's really what we're doing. So if you're in your player controller, you don't even have to do these two nodes. Since I'm in my character, I do need to use these two nodes because I need to grab the player controller to get this next node. Now, we want to use our enhanced input local player subsystem. This is essentially doing the mapping between the character or the local player and the context that we're going to give it so that it knows what values to pull from, what inputs we need to be giving it to perform what input actions. It's making that connection here. So if we drag off our player controller, we can then literally search for this. So enhanced input local player subsystem. And you can see I didn't even have to type most of that in. But you want to get enhanced input local player subsystem. And it comes out just like this. So it's a weird looking node, but it's actually not complicated to get at all. Then you can drag off of that node and type add mapping context. And you'll get this node right here. And once you have this, the enhanced input local player subsystem will be the target. The mapping context you have to choose. I only have one right now, so I'm going to use my character context that we made earlier. But this is where you could change around your context and then thus change your controls or change your mode of input for the player. Priority of 0 is the priority of the mappings, so this is kind of related to that consume input we talked about earlier. I only have this one right now, so I'm leaving priority 0 as the priority. And then you have options, which you can right-click and split the struct pin to see more things, but I don't really need these right now either. So I'm going to go ahead and recombine that struct pin and just leave it alone. Those are the default values in that option structure. Now, once you have this event firing, you will finally be able to capture the enhanced input right here. So now let's actually test out our different inputs. With a pressed input action, when I press the appropriate key, it says started, triggered, then completed in that order. Well, since it's a press, it's really just have I pressed this or not. So it's very simple. I can't really get any easier than that. That's our standard input action. So enhanced input doesn't do too much for us there. Let's go ahead and go to our character context and try out something else. Let's try the hold. Now, if I am to hold my input for a given amount of time, right now I don't have any modifiers, any specific values in here. So it's just the default amount of time that Unreal requires for a hold to be successful. I will then go into the completed. So I can hold, you'll see it started, ongoing, triggered. Now I can release at any point and it will have been considered a held input. So once I release, it is completed. If you want, you can slow that down and take a look at it. It might be a little bit easier if you can see the changes in the states, because I know the print strings go away kind of quickly. Now, if I do the same thing, but I release the input before I reach that triggered threshold, it is going to go to canceled. It was not considered held long enough to be a hold input, so we don't treat it as one. So I press and release. Started, ongoing, and canceled. It was never triggered. The triggered is when the conditions are met, and so at that point I can release the input and then go to completed. So that's how hold works. There's also a tap. So it has to be pressed and released within a given frame, or given number of frames, or given time period. And so if I press, I go to started, ongoing, and then it gets canceled because I'm still holding it. Alright, but if I tap it, started, ongoing, triggered, completed. But see, if I'm holding it, it gets canceled because that's not considered a tap anymore. I'm not tapping it, I'm holding it. We can go back again. Now there is released, which works just like released of the input action, so that one's pretty simple. While I press it, it's considered ongoing because I haven't released it yet. And then when I release it, it triggers it and it's completed. There is combo, which is really cool. It is basically how we have our input buffer and our commands. We can add actions into the combo array, and they have to be pressed within a time frame to actually trigger. I'm not going to use that one right here. For the last one, let's do down. Down is similar to hold, but not exactly the same. So when we press the key down, it is being triggered the whole time. And so essentially as we hold it down, we are meeting the criteria. So once we release, then it completes. Now this is extra useful for if you have different inputs, not just a press and not just a hold, but if you want to charge something. Remember, we have charge attacks in our fighting game as well. Well, we can hold it and it's being triggered that whole time. Then when you release it, it's completed. The hold required you to hold it, and if you released it too early, it didn't fire. But this is like an actual charge up where the longer you hold it, the more times it is triggered. So that's what down is. That's the difference between down and hold there. And so there are a lot of use cases in this enhanced input system that we're going to see a lot more of in the future. And I'm excited to really explore this in each series, but I wanted to have a generic video out here so you understood the very basics and how to set up the system so that you could play around with it in your game. But other than that, guys, that's all I've got. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped you. If it did, please subscribe. It means the world to me, and it really helps out the channel. Additionally, I want to give another shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for making this video possible and for all the support you give me. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, guys, as always. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to reach out in the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and you can get caught up, and we'll get you fixed up in no time. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.